I just took the title of the session, it was Self and Identity, and I tried to look at how I would present this like personally, and also scientifically. So the first part, I'm going to give you a general personal account of who I am, and it's in a pretty standard terms. And then I want to talk about some science of this, and then a very personal account. And if I have any time at the end, number 4 is some really weird true science. And if I get to it, you may find out why you're not who you think you are. Okay, so just generally, my name is James Henry Fallon, and I'm Irish Sicilian American, and I'm a white heterosexual male. And that's who I am in a very categorical sense. And I never even thought about any of this. The one thing about being a white heterosexual male is you don't look in the mirror every morning and say, you're a white heterosexual male. I never thought of it until our son was about 6. And I'll get to that one second. Now, and I found out, first of all, that my name is not James Henry, it's James Harry. I didn't find that out until I was 13. And I also found out when I was about 40 that we're not Irish background at all, even though the name is O'Fallon. And the family was adopted by a British family. So we're all British, and it explains some of what we may have inherited, too. And there's more things to it. So I'm a white heterosexual male, middle-class, agnostic, brought up Catholic, but now I'm nothing, baby booming, etc. And that's an extension. And when I looked at that just now, I realized it started looking like a genetic code. And that's interesting, because the genetic code written that way is about 3 billion letters long. Now, as I said, I never thought about being white or male or heterosexual until our son, and he's on the right here. This is an interesting guy. He was born in Chicago, lived here for 3 months, and spent 99.9% of his life in Southern California, yet he still thinks he's a Chicago guy. Everything's about him Chicago. He was here for 3 months. And he would, when he was growing up, starting at 5 or 6, his Halloween costumes, he wanted to go as air, a curtain, he went as a box. As a guy that was a 2-month preemie, and he didn't start speaking until he was 3, but then he started saying interesting things. But anyway, at about 6, he asked me, he says, are there any white people in your side of the family? Now, a Sicilian background, certain times of the year we get really dark. But it was really floored me, and he was absolutely serious. He's a really honest guy, too. And I realized there were a couple of things going on. First of all, he was really bouncing off his mother. Now, our very good friend was the coach of the Harlem Globetrotters. He told her, about 10 years ago, he says, I've been every place on this planet. He says, you are the whitest person I've ever met. This is her kind of dark. This is as dark as she gets. So compared to her, my whole family looked very dark, so he thought we were all just brown or black people. And that was quite remarkable to me, and it wasn't until later, see, he was never quite convinced, when we lived in East Africa. And I set up some labs there, and then he realized that we really were white. And as part of that experience, and I worked there, and we stayed there, lived there, and then all these guys and gals came over and worked in my lab, and they all have a very interesting story. Now, the guy in the back is a Luo. That's Obama's tribe, and you can see him in the front also. When I was in Kenya, he said that you're not going to know really who you like or are. He says you could be the person you'll be closest to, maybe somebody from my tribe who lives, down the street from me, and he says, I haven't found exactly who I am yet. Well, when he moved to the United States, he was a brilliant guy, top of his class, from the University of Nairobi, top of his medical school class. He got a PhD with me. And then he became a doctor. And before long, he started sending pictures. And it was pictures of him on a horseback and with cowboy gear on. And he was going around Kansas and Iowa. Every moment he had, he visited farms. He's really a country guy. And he felt at home, okay? So there's place, and then there's value systems and all these things about the physical environment that are quite interesting. We studied this in Morocco just recently. Now even though I'm dressed like this, see, this is Sundance Film Festival gear. You're dressed in black, you're supposed to look like a badass and everything. And, but really, I dress normally like an all-night poker game, like a professor, right? And, but really underneath this, underneath the one layer underneath, in my head, I'm like, it's 1975, and I'm Don Johnson. And so I had to at least wear the shoes. So that's in my head. It's not what you think. That is my niece, who's a screenwriter. She's brilliantly funny. But anyway, we all think of ourselves, we show others and ourselves and who we really are, and I want to go a little deeper than that. Now, since I'm a neuroscientist, and I lead a very standard life, the first date I had with my wife was 12 years old. We've been going together since we were 16. So we've been together like 50 years. And we got like a white picket fence house and everything. And I'm like a regular guy, and we're a regular family. But I see the behavior and self and identity in a very mechanistic way, because I'm a scientist and a biologist to boot. And so we look at the way a neuroscientist looks at behavior and self is something like this. So right in the center you see behaviors. That's what we can measure, right? And underlying those behaviors are brain circuits. Now those circuits we can study using a PET scanner, fMRI, et cetera, with different tests. And we can tell all sorts of things now that are associated with behaviors. This is the circuitry for knowledge of self. This is self-awareness. So we have that information, but that's not enough. Just having that sort of imaging information is not enough, nor is just the genetics enough. You have to put things together in a mathematical model, and it's a very powerful way to do business, our business. Now, if we go back and look at the root of this, so we look at the final behaviors and we look with imaging at the brain circuitry, but now we look at the genes. Not only the genes, but other things that are in the nucleus of the cell. And so the next thing is, are we all the same? So as a biologist, you say, well, are we the same? Are we really different or not? And we can ask this by asking the genetic question. So what I tried to do Sunday is go through. I said, okay, there's 21,000 genes, and that there's about 10 promoters per gene, and about 4 million regulators. Went through all these regulators, and then did kind of a permutation analysis, a very simple one. And I'm not going to go any further because I know what you're thinking. You're going, this guy's going to do one of those talks, and I'm not. I'm going to stop right there and give you the bottom line number. So in figuring out all the permutations of all the genes that we have, and all the regulators, and all the non-genetic genetic stuff, it turns out that, and here's this handy chart, this is the number of possible human beings based on the genetics and the epigenetics. And that number is 1 times 10 to the 81st power. That's 1 sextillion. Now, I didn't pick the name, the number for that reason. It just turned out to be sexy. I saw that. I said, I can't use it because it looks contrived, but there it is. Now, that number, I didn't know what to compare it to. So I started to think of all the things I could. So I said, how about, let's see, how many stars are there, and how many galaxies, and I looked up the number of atoms in the universe, the entire universe. And it's 1 times 10 to the 82nd power, which means that there are the same number of atoms in the universe as possible human beings. Now, if you really think of that, that means that none of us are like any others, okay? So we're incredibly unique. And you may think it's on very superficial things, but it isn't. It's on some very profound things about behavior and knowledge of self and self-awareness, identity. And so now if I go to my very personal account, now if you're an educated, white, heterosexual, middle-class male in the dominant culture, and then you start wondering like I did in the past 6 years, that about my personal self and group identity, if you're that kind of person, then you basically have to make stuff up, all right? Because you still look in the mirror and you go, you're just funny, you're a little fat, or a lot fat. But anything else, you don't really think of it. So you have to make stuff up. But now I'm not making stuff up. What happened is the following. So I was this really regular guy with a really stable family. And about 6.5 years ago, something happened. And this was a series of real serendipity. All these things happened sort of randomly, very spooky. and all within a couple of months of each other. I had been studying since about the early 90s, as a side thing to my stem cell stuff, the brains of killers. So every time a killer would come in, I would look at the PET scans and try to figure out what was going on. So I did that for a number of years, and then what was laid on me were about 70 brains all at once. So it was usually one at a time, maybe a couple a year. When they were all there was a pattern that formed, and it was a regularized pattern that I had never heard of before. So I started to give some talks on this, that there is a pattern to these psychopathic killers. A little different than impulsive killers, but psychopathic killers. A lot of them really horrible, horrible guys. And so something happened at 60. So here is what happened. Just at this time, when I got this pile of killers' brains, we were also doing an Alzheimer's study. We're looking for the genes that were involved in Alzheimer's. My wife's mother and father died of Alzheimer's, and we said, look, it may be something we can do. Maybe, I asked my wife, I said, do you really want to know this? Whether you have the genetics and the brain pattern of it, and do the kids want to do it? And then is that going to be any good? And she went for it, which was quite amazing. It was a little act of heroism, I would say. But so anyway, and all the kids did, and I did some of my brothers and a bunch of people in my family, and we were going to be normals in this study of Alzheimer's, right? And hopefully my wife and the kids didn't show up with this really bad combination of genes. So here are some of the results. And if you look at it, on the left, there's one family member, another one. So these are three on the left are three kids. And then the fourth one is one of my brothers. On the one that's in blue, and the blue with the EEG means she can't relax. She's thinking of something all the time, right? And the one on the right is me. And when I saw this pattern, as I was going through sequentially, I saw the one on the right, and I thought it had been mixed up with the killer group, because it looked exactly like what I had been looking at for years. And when we broke the code, because I'm doing this blindly, it was actually me. And so here is my PET scan, and there is the pattern for a psychopath. That is the areas that are turned off. And the areas that are turned off are mostly in the frontal lobe, the middle, and at the base of the brain. And they have to do with moral reasoning and a sense of ethics and morality. But also, if you look down in the temporal lobe there, it's an area of blue. That's the amygdala. And normally these things are in balance. But in psychopaths, these are turned off. And the balance is off. As a bonus, my insula, the part that has to do with empathy, was also turned off. And I laughed at this, and so after about a year or two, I decided to look at the genetics further, because people were saying things to me that were a little bit funny I wasn't listening to. But anyway, I tested for all these kind of warrior genes and empathy-related genes, and I had every high allele we tested for, and they were related to aggression and violence. And it became a little disturbing at this point. But I looked at myself, and what was the ultimate behavior? I was okay, And then somebody said you should take some psychopathy tests. And I took these, and I turned out to be a borderline psychopath based on this. Now, on the top, I'm almost all of those, and then those are positive sorts of things. This kind of glib, I always try to manipulate people. It's just a game I've always played. And, but it's true. I just thought it was something I did as sort of a game. But anyway, it's also some negative things on the bottom. But I haven't been in jail, and I do have some bad behaviors. And what I did at that point is I started to ask people what they thought of me. I said, what do you really think of me? And every one of them told me I was a sociopath. My wife, like everybody. And disturbingly, all the professionals, I know a lot of psychiatrists, and they said, well, we've been telling you this for years. You just don't listen. And I looked at letters from people, over the years, and they said the same thing. I thought they were individual events. When somebody goes, oh, you're crazy. You go, oh, yeah, I'm crazy. And I would say, you're really crazy. But and so they all told me this, and in the end, I didn't care at all. I didn't care, and it just didn't bother me. It still doesn't bother me at all. I just don't care. And I have a different kind of empathy than you're supposed to have. And this was a sort of a disturbing thing, but my wife had been through who I am. She says there's two guys there. There's this funny, happy-go-lucky, great guy. And she says there's this dark, quiet person that is trying to get you. And she knew, and that was true. When I asked my kids and everything, he said, of course, this is true. My mother has stood by me. You know, she's the one, though, back there, she says, you got to read this book. And I'm finished, so I can't do the last thing, but I'll wrap this up. She says, you got to read this book. This was at the same time, six years ago. She says, it's about your father's family, the British part of your family. And in that book, it was called Killed Strangely. It's about the Cornells in my family. It's the first case of matricide in the colonies. This is of a son killing a mother. And that was my direct great-grandfather in 1667. But the worst part about it is there were also 7 more murderers along that line to us. And it ended up with my cousins Lizzie Borden, shown there. Since then, in the past couple of years, my cousins, who are one's an editor of a paper, found another series of murderers. So there's all these people, and the question is, why aren't I one of these people? And it occurred to me that just because I were one of these people, it occurred to me that I had a wonderful childhood, and my parents went out of their way to take care of me. What had happened was that they wanted a large family. They had my oldest brother. My mother had 5 miscarriages, and then me 5 years later. When I showed up, I was the orchid child. Just the fact that I lived, okay? And then 4 more years until another. So I was right in the middle, and that was the first thing. So I was taken care of by everybody, the whole extended family, and all I remember is wonderful things. And then, but also my mother said when I was about 10, 11, I started acting very strangely, and she was going to have me go to a psychiatrist, and she didn't. She just watched me. And so everybody took quite good care of me. And so of this so-called 3-legged stool, which it looks to be the fundamentals of psychopathology, one, the genetic alleles, but you also have to have this altered brain pattern that I showed you, but there's also has to be early abuse, not later abuse. And the abuse and the isolation has to be severe, and I never had that. And in fact, I have what's called the high-risk serotonin transporter, but that particular gene, allele, which is high risk, if you're treated really well, it turns the other stuff off. This is kind of a very surprising finding in the past year and a half. And that's probably what happened. We'll never know, because the experiment wasn't done. But I should be a very, very bad person, and I'm only sort of a bad person. Anyway, thank you. Sorry for going over.